Interesting. You obviously are a location manager, but you're also a production manager, aren't you? Sort of, have you
Yeah, I
flipped
just
between
sort of
the two, or you?
transitioned over a little bit in the last few years. I mean, I was happily location managing. I always liked the job because it gave me the freedom. Not only in Vancouver, we're very lucky. Of course, you know this from just the volume of shows that we do here. So we're lucky because we're exposed to a lot of job possibilities and work possibilities. So I kind of had my pick in a lot of ways and was quite happy location managing for the same reasons that I had children, small children, and so it was easy to manage a family life and not be stuck on set and still work in the film industry. But I think that now in the last few years, my kids are both teenagers now, and so I just could start to lighten up and do other things. And the production managing side started, the opportunities started coming my way, so I took them, and it's been great. It's been different and a little bit less than creative than I'd like, less creative than I'd like. But the great thing is that as a locations person coming into shows, what I really like to do is to work new shows, and that's kind of, I think, going to be my bag, is that I'll just want to start a show or do a movie or something along those lines where it's just a one-off, so you can still contribute a little creatively and not just be the bad guy in the room that's saying no to, you can't spend this money, you can't spend that money. It's a little bit more my pursuit to still be able to add some creative things to the job or to the process.
So are you hoping to sort of dictate proceedings then a bit more in terms of going forward with the projects you work on? And
Yeah.
what are you're on Turner and Hooch, is that right at the moment? Or
Yeah, Turner and Hooch. It's like an action comedy with Josh Peck, and the showrunner Matt Nix did Burn Notice for many years, so he's very comfortable in this format. And it was just a neat thing to start to flesh out what Disney Plus is going to look like, because I think that at least when we started the show, I think that they're still getting their legs, and as the last year has proven, they have some possibilities. And so it'll be interesting to see how this show flies in July. It's going to come out in the summertime, and we'll see how the people respond to it. But I think it'll be good. It's very funny. It's a charming show. It's got enough action that adults will be engaged by it, but it's really meant to be a family, kids kind of, not too juvenile, but it's something a whole family can watch together. When I was growing up, I watched like the A-Team and shows where it was light and frivolous enough, and it was still that encapsulated episodic structure that we could sit on a Tuesday. It was pretty mindless. My dad would watch it. Me and my brother would watch it with him, and it was just this family event to watch that show on a weekly basis. And I think that that's what the showrunners are trying to do on this show as well, make it a little family Saturday, Friday kind of show in that same vein. So, and it's hitting the mark. Like I'm actually really impressed by what we've been able to do.
When were you filming?
We started filming in late August, right? We were one of the first shows to come back in Vancouver. There was probably 5 shows that came within 2 weeks of our sort of restrictions being approved, or our protocols being approved, so that we could work within the restrictions. And so we came back pretty quickly. We were ready to go. Our dogs were not as ready to go as we would have liked, but outside of that, everything else was really ready to go. We had our sets built. We had a general sense of how we were going to accomplish the show with the restrictions that we had, and I think that we've managed it pretty well. Yeah.
What were the requirements at the time then? I mean, because I'm interested to know the situation then and now, obviously, as well in Canada.
Yeah.
And is it sort of broken down by region? And what protocols did you have? Did you have really strict COVID protocols?
Yeah, we have. I would say that we're probably as strict as anywhere, and probably a little bit more. The studio is certainly more focused on it, because the reality is that we were in the first batch of shows coming up, so there was not a lot of opportunities for us to be able to litmus test what the protocols were and what this was going to look like. We just devised our own plan. And initially, before the studio really had their own set of protocols, we had come up with our own plan, which was based a lot around kind of an exposure control plan that you would have had, if there was like a virus breaking out of like an Ebola outbreak or something along those lines. Like that was the framework that we had used to devise our first plan of how are we going to live hand in hand in like an Ebola pandemic, and so it was rather strict off the top. We didn't we had obviously the zone work was predominant in that we had our folks segregated into areas, or they've called it now pods. At the time, we were calling it zones, which has led to a lot of confusion for people on sets. But we were really segregating people and how they could work so that you weren't interacting with anyone, and we were doing a lot of our meetings via Zoom and things like that. So it was similar to what we're doing now. I think we've gotten a little bit looser, and we've realized that the general tenets of hygiene and mask wearing and staying distant, those three kind of biblical commandments around what the plan is, those are the key things now. But at the time, everything was being, treated in that same way. We had separate holding areas for our equipment. We had separate staff cleaning our equipment. We had, whatever we were bringing in from the outside world that was being shopped for was being held for 24 hours before we were allowed to touch it. Things like that, which have gradually relaxed, and we've realized the sort of the insanity of it, or the nonsense of it to a degree. But I think in general, we've had I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this out loud. We've only had 4 exposures on our show, and we've had no shutdowns because of outbreaks or exposures. So we've managed it rather well, and we really haven't received much of a bump, other than having to stretch out our work time-wise. There hasn't been much of a bump due to the enhanced protocols.
So have you found generally that the crew have adapted pretty well, and did you have a longer sort of prep time beforehand in order to make sure everything was in place before shooting?
We had a little bit of a longer prep time, probably about 3 to 4 weeks more time. The crew was, so things were in place. We didn't really, it was so organic, I would say, that we really didn't have any deliberate sense of what was right and what was wrong. I mean, I keep joking with people that every time I would have a call with the studio or with the risk managers or with whomever, the talk was always like, this is what we propose to do. Do you think this is a good idea? And everyone would just go, I don't know. No one knew what the right thing to do was. So we just kind of, we trudged along thinking that what we were doing was the right thing to do, only because we used, like I said, some sort of bizarre, almost a wartime exposure control plan mentality about things. Let's really tackle this like we're in an exposure zone, and that's what we're that was the root of what we were modeling ourselves after.
And where were you shooting exactly? Like which locations? And were you involved in that side of things? Obviously, with your past experience,
yeah,
we shot all in that respect.
The whole show's been shot in the Lower Mainland of Vancouver and around Vancouver, British Columbia. We haven't left the Lower Mainland, which is kind of like the 5 boroughs of southern British Columbia. So most of our television production takes place in this sort of area, right? What we call the zone in the Lower Mainland. And so we didn't have to leave it very much. We've stayed around. We've shot a lot on location, remarkably, because the show generally, we had expected or hoped to have a little bit more of a stage component to our work where we can really control things. But the world was rather open to us, and because it had been 6 months or 5 months for a lot of locations not receiving the revenues that they get from location filming, they were pretty inviting once we got going. Because our provincially, we were already in a low number situation. Come the summertime, we were dipping pretty radically, and I think that people had that initial phase 1 fatigue, I call it. So they were ready and receptive to invite us into their spaces. And because we had come up with provincially, the province had done a really good job of devising their protocols and presenting them to the studios, even though the studios themselves, from what I gathered, they had their own counter proposals and they had their own requirements anyways. I think they kind of met in the middle somewhere, and the public was really receptive right away. So we had a few bumps with a few institutions here, there, and everywhere that were still assessing the risk of having filming. But generally, we had a lot of support in neighborhoods. We had a lot of support in most of the established filming locations. Newer filming locations were more challenging. So things that aren't filmed as frequently were more challenging. But
such as which locations are you referring to there?
Well, we've had some municipal properties that I don't want to out them for being tough, but there's some municipalities here that were much more skeptical of inviting film back into their world. So it took a little bit of work with them to really convince them and present very, very thorough work plans and safety plans. And then once they got that and their risk managers would buy into it, then of course then they open the doors. But generally the public's been fantastic here in the Lower Mainland, and businesses, individually owned businesses, are very inviting. Of course, they've lost a ton of revenue over this. So I think that our business has been one of the ones, certainly in British Columbia, we're in the top 3 contributors to last year's net take that the province has gotten. So I think that we've been a big welcomed event for a lot of people, and usually we're a third sort of revenue stream for a lot of places like halls and things like that. But I think that we've become the principal revenue stream for a lot of locations, theaters, clubs, restaurants. These places have just we've eaten them up, obviously, in the last 12 months with this. So that's what they're seeing, is they're seeing the benefit of having a film shoot in a place for 4 days or 5 days, and they get a little cash to carry them through another 2 months or whatever it is.
And what was it like working with Disney? I mean, you mentioned obviously about Disney Plus. I mean, what's the experience been like? Has it been quite straightforward? Are they quite hands-on, or? They're
very hands-on. I think that the studio has been very, obviously very invested, because we were the first batch of shows to come out the gate for them. They've been extremely hands-on. They've been very invested in what we're doing, methodically, like logistically or practically. I think that creatively, I wonder how. I mean, this is the great excitement of being on a show that still doesn't have its legs or doesn't know what it's going to be yet, is that you're figuring it out as you're making the show. And a TV show is much different that way than a feature. A feature, somebody has a very clear and distinct idea in their mind, in their mind's eye, of what the show is going to look like. But in a television show, I think that everyone's used to more of the rote, it developing its language after the first couple of episodes. So I think conceptually and creatively, I think that people just they might have had an idea for the show, but I think that we kind of had to mess with that a little bit, because the practicalities of having 100 extras and having pratfalls in public spaces with a dog and an actor are just not the same in a pandemic than they would be normally. Like, we couldn't go outside and have our 200 people in a very busy subway station or whatever it was, and have that comedy of a really wide shot, a really cinematic wide shot of a dog pulling an actor through a crowd. That's a lot harder to accomplish now. So that particular vein of the comedy, or the attractiveness of this kind of a show, we've had to reinvent that a little bit, I think.
The cast been pretty good about that, obviously making those changes.
The cast on the show, I can say, I mean, I've been doing this for 20 plus years now. The cast on the show, unbelievable. They've been fantastic. For people that couldn't move and weren't invited to do very much, asked to stay home, asked to kind of contain their life and move to a foreign city and then come and just show up here and show up to work. I'd say we have to be the luckiest people in the world to have a cast that we have had. So I would nothing but kudos and homage to their resilience in all this, for sure. Yeah.
And what's the current situation, and what are you working on at the moment in terms of filming in Canada and in British Columbia, and the logistics of getting there, and obviously bringing crew in from other countries? Is that a relatively straightforward process, or has it become a lot harder?
It's become a lot harder, but it's also, we have always had the benefit in British Columbia of having a sizable enough film community that we are we're self-reliant here quite a lot. So the studios do involve themselves in their own particular projects, but generally as a community here, we are almost like our own, we're almost like our own production bubble in a way. And so whenever someone has an experience with immigration or with the law, some risk manager, some location or whatever it is, there's always a lot of dialogue between shows and between people. So we have a great pool of information right away. I'd say probably there's not an instance where we have an experience that someone, like, there's very few pioneers in that way. Nobody's gone and, I think we were amongst the first shows that brought any of our creative producers up from Los Angeles. And at the time, the borders were completely shut down. And we have a 2-week quarantine that we have to do. And so everybody was nervous that, oh, we're going to do the testing that we have to do, and then we're going to have to quarantine. The showrunners are not going to want to do that. The producers are not going to want to do these quarantines. The actors then aren't going to want to do these quarantines. And remarkably, everyone's just accepted these realities, and we've made it work. It's not always convenient to have a cage director who's come up from LA. They're going to be here for a 10-day shoot, and they have to quarantine for 14 days. So that's an unusual thing. They are prepping, of course, for 7 days, and then they're here shooting for 10 days. So but it's been and that's been unusual. We've had a couple of Emmy winners here and people like that have come to direct episodes, and they've been just completely wonderful about the whole thing, like really patient, tolerant, and I think everyone understands the nature of what's gone on here. So I think that just the possibility of working and the concept of getting back into a show while it's in the, we're very brisk here. It's very brisk in this show. We're constantly moving. There's a lot of youth and energy. Our writing staff is young, and they're really energetic. So we're moving quite a lot here, and I think that people are, film folks love that energy. They're adrenaline junkies in a different way. I think that people have been really craving that moment, and so we haven't had any negative, nothing. It's just been so positive. I can't believe it.
What's the situation at the moment, though, in terms of getting into the country and filming?
Yeah, right now we can still quite simply get people into the country, whether it's above or below the line. It really doesn't matter if you're coming to work. Most people come from the US. We have some people coming from the UK, and that's been fine as well. Everyone has to do a 2-week quarantine. We've just instituted in the last couple of weeks a 3-day quarantine prior to getting into your full 14-day quarantine, where you have to go to a government recommended hotel for 3 days before you can move into your own private space. But we have our showrunner who's in quarantine right now, who's come up from LA for a couple of weeks, for the last few weeks of our shoot, and he's in quarantine at a hotel or at an Airbnb, I think now. And yeah, I mean, everyone's just been doing it, but it is 2 weeks, and they do check up on you. The government's very keen on making sure that people aren't breaking that protocol. I think we're getting a little bit of a less rigorous look-see, because people know that the Hollywood in particular, with the SAG and DGA white letter of understanding that went around with the testing requirements, that we are heavily monitored and we are testing heavily. So I think that people are letting up a little bit in terms of the government, and immigration people are letting up a little bit. Because they know that we're paying attention to that sort of thing. So there is some monitoring going on, but it's not probably as rigorous as other businesses or other people traveling up.
So do you see in the coming sort of weeks and months a lot more projects happening, films and TV series in the area, in the region, in the province?
Oh, I think it's going to be very brisk here. My concern always is that as the US vaccinates so much more, for us, we're predominantly US service business right in Vancouver. I don't think that there's any, I don't think there'll be any reduction because of the quarantines, and their vaccination rate is higher than ours right now. But I think it'll level off between the two very quickly. I think it'll be a couple of months. I think that we'll probably see a very brisk year here. Yeah. I mean, I'm always concerned that the dollar, there's some pressures with the dollar and things like that happening between the two sides of the border. But I don't think it's substantial enough yet for it to become a problem. I think if inflation does hit the US and their currency value goes down, then it'll start to get a little bit skinnier here. But generally speaking, I think it'll be a brisk year for us. Yeah.
Fantastic. And tell me about some of the locations available in the area. And obviously, Canada's doubled for the US a hell of a lot on a lot of shows over the years. So just talk to me about some of the locations you have on offer and why they're so appealing.
Well, the downtown, our downtown areas, we don't have a lot of downtown space to shoot in, but we do have looks that are so similar to anything in California. We have areas that look like New York City or Chicago. We don't have tall buildings like Chicago or New York does. So if you're not looking up, then you're doing just fine. But the benefit here has always been that you could run to a very natural setting and then run back to the city in the same day. Right. So you can go to a location that's heavily forested. You look like you're in the middle of nowhere. And, 2 hours later, you're shooting in a downtown concrete sort of jungle, and it's a simple accomplishment. Vancouver, BC, especially Vancouver, like the Lower Mainland, has always been, that's been our biggest selling point, is that you can get a vast diversity of locations, and it's not spending 6 hours in a car going from one place to the next. It's all within an hour or two. You're driving, and you've got a forest here. We've got mountains on the North Shore. We've got beaches that are just, the west side of the Lower Mainland is all beach. We've got a lot of urban looks, and there's different pockets of that. So we can get a heavily modern, concrete sci-fi. You obviously know that we do a lot of superhero, sci-fi, and science fiction sort of stuff, and that's always been because we are a pretty new city, and so we have this modern architecture that's the dominant look of the area. But we do have our little pockets of older looking stuff as well. Not nearly as old as the UK or anything like that, but or even Eastern Canada's got a lot more rock and brick and stone and things like that. We're a woodsier kind of place, but there's enough concrete here that we can make up for it, and we augment very well. The one thing that I'd say, I always say this as a sort of a basal rule of being a locations person in Vancouver. It's like the essential thing is that we're very good at adapting our spaces. We will see through what something is to what it could be much sooner than a lot of people. So if production designers come here, or producers come here from abroad, they're always sort of disappointed in a way that they're like, well, there's not much more to look at. There's not a lot of this. There's not a lot of that. And we're always, I think, craftier because we have to do it so frequently. We have to turn, you have to turn a hall into a factory from the 18th century. We have to turn, an existing concrete box into something else. It's what you get that very quickly. I've shot a bowling alley as a restaurant. You just find these weird things that designers will want, and you have to be able imaginatively to suggest. And sometimes nobody wants to hear it from a locations person. In a lot of ways, they don't always want to hear what our thoughts are about things. But sometimes you're just very softly and diplomatically suggesting to designers or producers or directors even, saying, well, what if you took this, this hotel lobby is very nautical looking. Could we not turn this into a cruise ship? And they'll look at you like you're crazy, and you start walking them through, look at, these are very nautical arches. We have a lot of nautical architecture here. So the suggestion's always been, like, if it's a hotel lobby and it's got these arches and it looks very, like there's the galley hole windows and things like that, you're talking to them and walking them through it, and they start to wrap their heads around it. So you're doing a little bit of designing all the time, even as a locations person here.
And are these sites generally quite amenable to your suggestions in terms of getting permits and bringing all the crew in and equipment, etc.? Is it generally quite straightforward, the process?
I think so. I'm always curious, especially when I go on LMGI panels and calls, and we have like group discussions. How hard is it to do stuff? I generally feel like in Canada in general, I think if particularly in BC, people are quite used to filming. It doesn't matter where you live in the Lower Mainland. At some point, a film truck is parked in front of your house. At some point, someone has knocked on your door and said, hey, we're going to blow up a car, a block away. Are you okay with this? At some point, someone said, we're shooting all night and there's going to be lights pointing at your windows in your bedroom. I think that everyone's kind of had that experience here. So people are generally pretty savvy to it. They realize the volume of it because they see the vehicles parked daily. There's multiple units parked downtown. So people are quite comfortable with that. So I don't think that generally our governments and our municipal councils, our permitting offices, we all have a huge permitting infrastructure. Every municipality has someone that issues a film, in particular a film permit. It's very, very common, and it's pretty unified in a lot of ways. It's generally treated the same way everywhere you go. So productions, when they're coming in, they're not grappling with a lot of different bureaucracies. They kind of have a familiar face, and they generally have a familiar pathway to getting the permit that they need.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think that generally the challenges are more in working in larger institutions or larger locations where the ownership isn't onshore or present here, or their risk managers aren't here, and that's when you're into a harder conversation, because then they're
Yeah.
not familiar with it. They don't know the facility with which production is quite comfortable working in. I've had to go to, I've worked in hospitals, which you'd think would be utter madness to go and work in a hospital but I've worked in hospitals with more ease than I've worked in some corporate offices, because the hospital folks understand that the region here understands how filming works. The people are all here, whereas the corporate office they might be offshore somewhere and they don't really understand what filming is. And then so you're trying to make a pitch to someone who's in Saudi Arabia and they don't really understand it. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's a different beast. But I think generally we're very lucky here. We get away with being able to film in a lot of ways that I think a lot of people don't. I think that it's frequency that's groomed that for people. We've really groomed the community. I always say that we've gained the cultural trust, community trust, as an industry that way.
Fantastic. Tell me a bit about yourself, just to broaden out. Obviously, I'd love to know your history in terms of how you got into the industry, where you grew up, and obviously your involvement as a location manager in a lot of big projects as well. So tell me a bit about your experiences. And
yeah, I mean, I think I was just I was a kid. I grew up in Ontario. I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Ontario, and I was just floundering in university. At some point, I was just frustrated with. I was in pure sciences, and I'm an East Indian background, so my family was directing me really to go into medicine and really do the hard sciences and find some profession like that. And I just don't like. I like art. I've always thought art and culture and sort of the gray areas of the world, human culture is fascinating to me. I was taking cultural studies classes in university, and that's what really turned me on to film. And then I worked in a restaurant with a fellow who was moving out to Vancouver and wanted to be in the film industry, and landed a job. And I touched base with him, and he said, "Oh, it's easy to get work here." I said, "Well, I'm going to try and make the leap, and I'd love to." There was a little bit of a fascination with, like any kid in their early 20s, I was reading, books like the Beat Generation sort of style, this very nomadic lifestyle, that hippy dippy lifestyle stuff, and came out here under those auspices and ended up getting a job, which spiraled into 3 jobs, which spiraled into, just being wrapped up in this world. And then probably in, like, I'd say 1999, I think that what happened in BC is they had a shift in the tax credit here that went into that went from just being a pure labor credit, and I think they were one of the first. They transformed a bit of their labor credit into a digital credit, a digital work credit. So there were some companies here that were really doing a lot with gaming, Electronic Arts being one of them, and there was some animation companies that were also starting, and all this stuff was sort of festering at the same time. But then the government introduced this digital and visual effects credit, and the town kind of blew up, because all of a sudden you could do all in one. You could shoot a show like physically, and then do all the post work as well here. And I just caught on to that. I latched onto that somehow inadvertently, and ended up working on, an X-Men movie, and doing some work, on bigger sized features, and just being exposed to that caliber of people. Once you're exposed,
what was that like? Yeah, I mean, like having that sort of leap into the big projects.
I still, to this moment, every time I get a job, I'm always like, I can't believe I'm lucky enough to do this. I was, the first show that I really got that exposure on was The Sixth Day with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and was directed by Roger Spottiswoode, who I knew had done a Bond film, and I knew had written. He actually directed the original Turner and Hooch, so it's pretty funny that it's come full circle. But when I got on that show, and Arnold, who, I was a kid of the 80s, so it was like the biggest movie star in the world, I got the chance to work with them and sort of spend time seeing how a show of that size was done. Once you got the bug, then it's just like every time that opportunity comes up, you're just angling to get on those shows. So I ended up getting on to that show. Then I went and worked on a show called Cats and Dogs for Warner Brothers. I went and did a show called the Santa Claus 2 with Tim Allen. It was like, the comedy, family comedy. Then I got on to X-Men, and it was just the spiral of just being in that conversation. Once you become a member of the sort of feature film crews here in Vancouver, I mean, they're always going to call the same people because you have the shorthand and you're growing your skill set in that way. And so for 10 or 12 years, I mean, that's all I did. It wasn't until I started to see, probably in the late 2000s, where I started to see my family life really suffering. I had small kids then, that I said, I've got to find another way to balance this. And I started thinking more about television and just taking a step back from these shows. Feature films are all consuming. They're, there's 120, 140 days of just full tilt, 15 hours a day, working, mad pace. And it's great to do it once a year maybe, or once in a while, but doing it year after year. I like, health wise, my health in 2009, I had a seizure,
Oh,
and
really? Wow.
I collapsed in my bathroom, and my wife picked me up and called the ambulance, and I went to the hospital. And for a day, I was in a catatonic state. I could not speak for 24 hours.
My
So when
God.
they did all the neurological tests and EKGs and all this sort of stuff, I had to do a sleep deprivation test as well. And they said essentially that you are chronically sleep deprived, and if you don't do something quick, you're gonna have a stroke. So I had to start valuing my sorry, I'm getting hailed to come to a meeting, but I had to start valuing my sleep and my care quite a bit at that point, and it really shifted gears for me. So it's something that I think that I'll probably be vocal about here locally, is just the mental health side of our job and industry, because I think that's going to be our pandemic here in the film business, because we've just had years and years of, that traditional working like an absolute beast for years. That has to change, has to modify it. Certainly in Hollywood, it's the norm. It's the norm to do a 15-hour day in Hollywood, and it's insane. It's a bit insane.
Do you think there's an acceptance and appreciation that needs to change, and an understanding from the senior figures in the industry that, hey, look, we've got to do something about this? Because when I've obviously spoken to tons of industry people over the years, and a lot of them say the same thing you just said, that they work crazy hours and it's just expected of them, and that's it. You can't complain, really.
Yeah, I think that it's coming around now. I think that the pandemic is going to highlight that for people. I hope it does. I think that it's going to become a crisis for people, because I think that some of these things in the community are starting to become huge topics of conversation. Mental health is a huge conversation right now. Certainly in our community in British Columbia, people are seeing the lingering effect of the pandemic is going to be what it is economically, but I think that the health impact, and we are a public health system here, just like the UK, so it impacts everybody in the same sort of way, and it becomes a local conversation. It becomes a community conversation when you're seeing that much of a problem dominate the hospital's space, or that industry's fold. But I think in our business, I think people are also realizing that it's just not as productive, and that as the craftsmanship level has increased in BC, I think people are starting to see here that there's a way to accomplish the same success, filming wise, product wise. The number of setups in a day, if you're going to gauge it by anything, how much we shoot is going to improve, and it doesn't cost you working 15 hours a day. Like, there's pathways, and there's strategies, and there's processes that we can instill in people and teach people, so that they can work efficiently, work smarter instead of working harder. And I mean, that's a part of any craft, right? I think that 20 years ago when I started, I think still the craftsmanship level was not as high as it is now. And I think we've learned a lot as a community in BC. Certainly, I've watched people become better craftspeople. And that, to me, is what's going to change us from working 13 hours a day to 10 or 11 and being efficient, Now for me, I can watch 5 minutes a day, how it impacts, 5 minutes an hour for me is crucial as a production manager. If I can manage that 5 minutes, I mean, it starts to become, it's dollars and cents. It becomes everything. So anything to give myself that 5 minutes every hour, we're looking for. I mean, that's kind of a bizarre metric to gauge your work by, right? But it is now become minutes. If I can shave minutes, then that's really saving my day. Yeah.
And extending from that, just very quickly, how would you say your sort of role has changed over the years, or the role of a location manager, and obviously now production manager as well? Have things changed considerably, and the way obviously things are now are obviously very different under COVID, but generally speaking, would
Yeah,
you say things have changed considerably?
I think they have, because I think, I mean, I can't speak for it generally. I can speak for it as someone from this region. I think that to go back to my point about the craft changing and evolving and developing, I think that years ago we sat quieter and we sort of took in what the US people, the producers, the creatives that would come from the United States would come here, and they had ideas and they trained us and they taught us, you know. I mean, I did, I did a Robert Zemeckis movie a couple of years ago, and I just sat back and watched like I would have many years ago. I wasn't going to suggest too much because I just wanted to see this maestro. You know, what are you going to do with the very limited? And my thought was, I think that the palette's too limited. I don't think we're getting him enough material to work with. And he was so inventive, and I think that that's what you learn from these craftspeople that are very experienced. They come and they're very inventive and they can adapt anything to anything and make it work for them. And that's something that we learned early on, and I watched for many years early on, quietly just sort of sitting back and watching. And then as times evolve, now I start to say more and more frequently and vocally, I think that we can solve this in a different way. I think that there's a way that we can shoot this that'll still accomplish the point of the story and make use of the limited location palette or whatever space, time, production, whatever the limitation or boundary is. As a production manager, you're talking about all sorts of boundaries. As a location manager, you're talking about space boundaries, literally. Like, you know, either it's just not creatively hitting all the marks, or it's hitting enough marks that you're going to go there, but you have to now modify the work to make it fit in the space. Now, as a production manager, that's just expanded a little bit. Now you've got some other financial limits, you've got some other departmental limits that might hinder what you're trying to accomplish. So I think that we've become more vocal here locally because our craft is developed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
another final broader topic as well, just very quickly, that in terms of diversity, would you say the industry is, I mean, it's a hot topic at the moment, obviously, but would you say it's become more diverse? Are you noticing, I mean, particularly in perhaps your field? Or
yeah, I feel like we were very progressive in BC. I've never felt particularly like it worked for me. That, you know, I've always thought, personally, as a person of color, I've always felt I've had to work a little bit harder. So that's the burden I sort of feel for myself. I have always had to work a little bit harder to show or prove or whatever it is, just to show. You know, I never was just a natural thing for me, and maybe that's my own experience. I don't know. I talk about it all the time. I'm not sure that there was such a few number of people of color in the business when I started. There was really only 2 or 3 people. And I've said it to them, and I've said it on panels, and I know it's a hot topic as it happens right now. So I always felt that I've had to work a little bit harder. Sometimes when I hear women speak, I always feel more attached to that, or I feel like that's a common experience. It's like, oh, the women have to work a little bit harder to get noticed, or work a little bit differently to get noticed. They can't work in the same way. And I sort of really identify with that. As time's gone on, the last 5 years, I certainly feel like our community here has gotten more diverse, but I always thought that we were a little bit more welcoming or inviting, because, you know, now I also feel like I spent most of my adult life in the film business. I don't know what civilians do. I don't know what it's like for in the civilian world. I only know that here, and the number of friends of mine that were LGBTQ or people of color or whatever it was, didn't speak English as a first language, that the opportunities have been there if you could do the work. And if you could do the work and really draw attention to how well you were doing, you had a shot. And so I think that was something that was always attractive in this community, but I know that people weren't willing to make that case 20 years ago. I think that that's really only happened in the last few years.
So you haven't personally experienced any restrictions, you think, based on your color? You just think, generally speaking, yourself, you felt like you had to prove yourself a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I felt restricted, or I didn't feel restricted early on. I did feel early on like there was a peculiarity about the way that the boys club kind of worked, you know, and I wasn't a part of it, and I never really thought that I would be. I never thought that I would, because your whole life you're never a part of that, you know. That's a part of that voice that I think that people don't hear when you're a person of color. And I think that that's what the conversation's evolving, is that I've spent my whole life not knowing that being a part of the club was a possibility. And the flip side of that, whenever I'm talking to obviously my white male friends, who are predominantly my friends. Like that's the predominant group of people that I'm friends with. But I always say to them, like, you guys can't understand this side of the conversation, just like I can't understand what it's like to naturally just be in a club. I've never felt like I was in the club. So for me, it's always like I'm always a little bit of the outsider all the time. And maybe that's my own baggage, but that's just the way that our lives are, you know, that's how it's evolved. I'm a middle-aged guy now, and I'm starting to see it shift. I don't think that groups are as you know, they don't just have that one, they're not that one shape or one color. So, you know, it's wonderful to watch, and I'm grateful that it's not going to be the world that my kids are in. They don't see it that way, but I never felt like I belonged in that way. And it was a part of probably the attractiveness of the film industry in the first place, because it is a very economically viable place to live and work as someone who loves the arts. And if you love the arts, I think that this is the best place to be working, because it's a great living and you're exposed to all the arts. You can meet painters, and I have friends that are architects and musicians, and they're all working in the film industry in different capacities. But I would never have this vast group of friends that are all artists that are working together towards something. So that's the beauty of film. That's the beauty of cinema.
Completely agree. And what are you working on next? Have you got another project lined up after Turner and Hooch, or is it still?
I'm really trying to get some sleep. This has been a grueling year. The great, also one of the great gifts of working in Vancouver is that you're always busy. There's always work. So I literally can turn my phone off for a month, and I know that the minute I turn it back on, that the phone will start ringing with something. So I'm really trying to just take a pause, because I've been working on this since last February. And so my kids, I feel like I got to reconnect with them and just take a pause after all this. You know, it is coming to the tail end of it, and I think we'll be wrapping right when our vaccinations really hit full swing for us. So I'm kind of hoping to just take a couple of months and just chill out, and then see what happens in the summertime. I don't know what's going to happen. There's lots of stuff brewing. So I just want to, I really want to sleep.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant. Listen, I'll leave you there. Thanks very much, Hans.
Yeah, you're welcome.